Welcome home to both of you, first of all. I think we're like 48 hours off the plane from this crazy trip to Azerbaijan. So we wanted to, while the everything was fresh in your mind, with the jet lag still fresh in your mind, wanted to talk about all the amazing conversations you guys had over in Baku. So let's start super high level, like key takeaways. What were some of the things that stuck out to you attending COP this year and heading into 2025?
So I'll go first, and I'd love to hear what you have to say too, Steph. So it was my first time at COP, so I didn't really know what to expect. And I was surprised pleasantly by how many people were there and how many countries were represented and how many organizations. Like in the world of COP, this was supposed to be a smaller one. It did not turn out to be that way. It was very large and very well run. But the thing, I think my biggest takeaway is that there's sort of this dichotomy between the world being hungry for U.S. leadership and hungry to learn more about the U.S. market, and the world being committed to moving ahead on addressing the climate crisis, regardless of what the U.S. does, right? Yeah. And so all of our conversations had some portion of that discussion in it. And it was also so clear to me what a quickly evolving marketplace this is, right? Like, we didn't do anything with the climate negotiations. We didn't do anything with the official delegations, really. We were talking country to country and business to business, and all about like export markets, import markets, sort of supply chain, and how do we continue to create reliable demand.
Yeah, and like the U.S. leadership piece is so interesting because it is sort of this combination of looking to the U.S. for leadership in all senses of that word, but then also trying to sort of jockey for position outside of that leadership. So what kind of a role do you see SEIA and companies in the solar space playing in that sort of U.S. leadership space in the future? Is it do we think it's growing? Do we think there's room for us to sort of take the bull by the horns a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the ground is fertile for continued U.S. leadership, and that leadership is probably going to look a little bit different with the recent elections. But I think industry and trade associations have quite a large part to play in what that looks like. Also, other levels of government, right? States, counties, towns will have a huge role to play. But I forget who we were talking to, but I honestly forget who the brilliant philosopher was. But right, the quote was "Nature abhors a vacuum," right? And so, if for a while there is a vacuum in terms of U.S. federal leadership, I think it's incumbent upon us to fill that vacuum, because if we don't, others will, and they might not be others that we would particularly prefer fill that vacuum.
Yeah, if there's one thing that's absolutely clear to me coming home, it's that the world, we know that demand for renewable energy in the U.S. is growing. We see that in our numbers. But going to a global convening like COP, it's so clear that there's demand all over the world for clean energy. And there's only a few big countries around the world that are capable of investing in solutioning to provide that kind of clean energy in those countries. So there's huge global market share up for grabs. Yeah. And if nothing else, the U.S. solar industry showing up at a climate convening like this to get business done is a benefit, I think, to all of our members.
Mm-hmm. And so you had mentioned to me earlier, Steph, that sort of that vacuum of U.S. leadership can be filled in a lot of different ways, and one of them is likely China, right? A huge player in the global economy and the global energy economy, and certainly the global clean energy economy. So I'm going to use that as sort of a segue to address some of the elephant in the room around this COP taking place less than a week after the U.S. election. How did that play into the conversations you had? Was it sort of dominating the conversation about Trump's return to the White House and how that affected U.S. climate leadership, or is there a more nuanced conversation going on?
I think there there was a much more nuanced conversation. I mean, obviously people were curious about what we thought. So we got asked about it in pretty much every conversation, but it was not the focus in the way that I thought perhaps it might have been. A lot of these folks and these other countries were at the table in 2017, the last time we pulled out of the Paris Accord, and the progress continued. The industry kept growing, and then we came back in 2021, and perhaps we're going to leave. Perhaps at the time this airs, we'll have left again. I think how you talk about risk being baked into price, right? Or like the interest rate increase or decrease has already been baked in. Feels a little bit like sort of the U.S. withdrawing from the Paris Agreement has already been baked into the conversation, and so it did not feel quite so disruptive to me. What did feel clear was, okay, so now what's the U.S. going to do, right? And as I said, the industry, the businesses, the other levels of government, and if not you, then who, right? So I think the point of China being very present at in the conversation, very obviously very present in the marketplace, it's clear who will try to step in if the U.S. abdicates leadership.
And I'd like to think that that's, a compelling case for, the Trump administration to at least remain engaged in these conversations, because it's all about American energy dominance, right? So, any other thoughts from you on the Trump of it all, or the?
No, I mean, I think Abby's right. Abby was a very popular spokesperson when we arrived at Baku, shall we say. She had 4 interviews on the first day, 6 or 7 interviews on the second day. We did Al Jazeera, BBC World, tons of German broadcasts, New York Times, Bloomberg, right? Folks are very interested in what she had to say about that. That was obviously the first question, but we could very quickly pivot to, the industry momentum and market share and conversations about supply chain and trade and what that's going to mean. So the subject matter expertise that Abby was able to bring to that conversation was super, super helpful. And I think we left Baku, I think having calmed some nerves around the world about what's going to happen in the United States. And of course, we can't see into the crystal ball, but we can stand tall behind what the data is showing us, and that is that the solar industry is going to continue to grow. It grew under the first Trump administration. It will grow again under the second Trump administration, even if he brings in tariffs. So, there's a lot of ways that we're able to talk about the nuances, and I think Abby's point about corporate risk mitigation is important, because none of these companies are doing only thinking the next 6 and 12 months ahead. They're thinking 3 to 5 to 10 years ahead. And they have to incorporate those political elements into their risk modeling. So that's a helpful framing for folks to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. Pivoting a little bit to just sort of the experience of it all and the human element of being at an event like this, talk a little bit about sort of what the vibe was like, what the energy was like in Baku, and some of the more non-solar wonk specific anecdotes that you had from your time over in Azerbaijan.
Well, first of all, I was really anxious about the logistics of it all, right? RE Plus is 40,000+ people. We knew there were going to be more than that in this city. That's a lot of people arriving in a town all at once. So I was not quite sure how that was all going to work. And I have to say, it was fairly seamless.
That's great.
It was that was a very welcome development. And I heard, right, because everyone shares their COP stories. It's like, how many have you been to? How many have you been to? And I heard this was remarkably smooth, given
great.
some of the other experiences people shared. So that was really good. But the energy in and then the other thing that I didn't realize is that it was at the location. It was the 1984 Olympics, right? When the Soviet Union hosted the Olympics, then the U.S. boycotted. So some people, we did not, but some people stayed at the Olympic Village, and it was the stadium with all of these temporary buildings built around it. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
But the energy inside of the room, it sounds so cheesy. It was very high energy. People came as they are, right? So they wore their clothing from their home countries, and there were so many languages being spoken constantly, and it was so incredibly diverse. On the pavilion floor, there were mostly country pavilions, right? And like from all over the world. I mean, it wasn't just the big countries, right? It was a lot of small countries that clearly had made a decision to invest in this. That was really cool. The press area was ginormous.
Huge.
Huge.
Biggest press file I've ever seen. Crazy.
Yeah.
Crazy large.
Wow.
It was wild. And like, I would randomly see someone walking along that I knew. That happened to you too.
Yeah.
It happened to Stacy. Like, so weird. And then
Hugs on the other side of the world are pretty cool.
Yeah, exactly. Like, how many people go to Baku? And then, like, the events at night, we would go to dinners and stuff at night with organized groups, and it was just beautiful. It's a really beautiful city.
That's so
It
cool.
was a really beautiful city.
Yeah, and what I would add to that, I plus one everything Abby just said. I think there are few topics that the entire world can get behind, and with although climate isn't a central core message for what we do at SEIA, we're all about market growth, job creation, economic impact. The environmental impacts of our industry are huge, and it was remarkable to walk into a place where 190 countries are represented, and there's delegations from each of those countries. Like Abby said, in their traditional indigenous garb or whatever, lots of headdresses, lots of jewelry, lots of skirts, lots of big fluffy outfits. But for folks to be here to talk about the same thing, for everybody to be in one place with the same goal in mind, not the same solutions, but the same sort of North Star, was amazing. There's no global convening I can think about anywhere else in the world where folks are thinking and talking about the same things, even if they don't agree on, the final outcome or negotiate a final outcome that works for everybody. Everybody showed up at the same time in the same place to talk about what the data is showing is happening to planet Earth. And that was fascinating to me. There were so many cultural elements, customs, but also just passion for having a common sense conversation about what's happening around the world and what we can do together to solve for some of those issues.
Yeah, that's amazing.
The other thing, so I found so much hope in that. Like, I was like, okay, we're going to be okay. Like, we're going to be okay because look at this convening. Plenty of like political power and willpower here to bring to the task. One of the days we had a briefing with the some members of the U.S. delegation, including John Podesta, and it was only for U.S. companies. Like, they literally like brought your company up on their iPad to make sure it was like a U.S.-based company or organization. And that room, that was filled to capacity at 150. They had to kick people out. And it was also really interesting to see how many Americans went. When we went, Steph and I went to see the Azerbaijani ambassador before we left, and he said that the U.S. had like 2,000 people going, right? Yeah, so it was a large contingent from the United States, and that too was it was a very visual reminder of kind of how many, in an issue that sometimes feels very fractious. Is that the word? You know what I mean? I don't know how you,
with it.
Yeah. Okay. Divided or whatever. You know what I mean? To have, because it's not an easy place to get to. It's not like you just swing by for the day. Like, all of these organizations, like universities, businesses. We saw some of our member companies we didn't even know were going. Yeah, they were right there. It was pretty heartening to see it.
That's so cool. You just mentioned universities, and I was going to ask about kind of the youth element here. When I think about the climate movement, that's such a huge piece of it. And I think there's all sorts of questions around what that looks like moving forward with Gen Z, and again, back to the Trump administration and all that. But what was that element in Baku? Was there sort of a youth climate movement presence? Was there sort of protest? Was there activism? What was that energy like?
Well, I'll just start because the difference between Baku and many COPs of recent history is that there wasn't a huge protesting element. The only folks that were able to bring signage in were the vegan folks.
The vegan activists.
The activists, yes, is the word. I was like, advocacy? That's not right. And so I don't know if the nature of their government is the reason for that, but there was no protesting. And normally that's part of the energy. There's like between 100 and 150 different types of groups that are protesting outside the blue zone, which is where we spent the bulk of our time, almost all of our time. So that was an interesting change this year.
Well, the other part was that, I mean, I heard this rumor, I don't know if it's true, that they gave the high schoolers 2 weeks off, the 2 weeks of COP off, and many of them volunteered as the guides, right? Because they could speak English and they know. So there were young people, like high school kids, and my gosh, they all had like COP29, Azerbaijan, all dressed alike everywhere, all over the arena and the blue zone and the green zone and inside and outside and on the corners and in the halls, like telling you exactly where to go and what to do and how to do it. And so just even though they weren't like cheering or protesting, their presence I found to be pretty inspiring. There were a couple occasions where I saw little kids like that were clearly there for some purpose, but I wasn't clear what.
So inside the blue zone and the green zone, there's different pavilions, just like at RE+. And different organizations represent the content in those pavilions. And one of them is, there's a whole bunch of different groups. But children and youth is one, faith and hope is one, there's business coalitions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there were kids being represented inside the blue zone to host programming about what decisions made at COP, how they will have an effect on their lives. And so bringing that voice, I think, is really important. The other thing I would mention to your question is, there's a ton of college students there. There were college students from Colorado and California and New York that were asking deeply sophisticated questions while Abby, Stacey, and I were, just sitting, listening to what the negotiators were talking about. But this really tremendous representation from American colleges and universities at COP. And I would only assume that those numbers are bigger at, in years past or will be next year too.
Yeah. Well, and I just think it's a really interesting, like COP is a good example of how there's a role both at the table and outside of the table, pushing and yelling at the table to make change. And I think that it sounds like there was a little bit of maybe a lack of some of the outside pushing and the activism, but that there's still a really important role for youth and for activists and folks who are sort of outside of the halls of power traditionally to be in those conversations. And I think that's really encouraging and exciting. But it'll be interesting to see where all sides of that go moving forward, which I think brings me to the next question, which is looking ahead to 2025. So we've got COP is in Brazil next year. What do we think that's going to change about the dynamics of who's there and how it works, and also what substantively we can expect out of next year's event?
So one of the interesting things is that we are members of the Global Solar Council, which is made up of trade associations of solar companies all around the world. Did I say that right? And the chair of that for the next 2 years is from Brazil. So, and he's a good friend. And so we saw him in COP. I saw him when I went to Brazil. So kind of, I think there will be an opportunity for sort of solar and the clean energy element as a solution set to be extra highlighted, given his role and Brazil's role in COP next year. It's in the Amazon, right?
It's in Belém, Brazil, which is in the Amazon.
So I think it will... I mean, I've been to one now, so like kind of an expert. But my anticipation is that it reflects sort of the place, and there will be a big focus on sort of some of the nature solutions and the impacts on like natural ecosystems. I think that will be a big focus of COP 30 in 2025. But we will go. I mean, Brazil is the third largest solar market in the world right now. And so we will be there to continue those conversations that and anticipate to be bigger, right?
Right. It will be twice the size as Baku. And we don't know this for sure, but we think, of course, deforestation will be an issue in Brazil for obvious reasons. Agribusiness and the energy transition. So like Abby said, there's a natural space for us as part of that
Mhm.
conversation. I mean, we talk about these issues all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But because of our close partnership with them, there's all sorts of inroads into making that activation even more productive from an industry perspective. And the other thing is that normally year to year, COP to COP, the priority for the incoming country will be some sort of whatever comes out of the previous year's COP, whatever final negotiations produced will be taken up in the following year. I don't actually anticipate much coming out of Azerbaijan this year from a global goal perspective. I think the goal coming out of Dubai was tripling renewable energy deployment by 2030, which we will meet.
Mhm. I think there was an energy storage goal that
Was
was
there?
being proposed in
Okay.
Azerbaijan. Yeah.
Okay,
That's
which would
exciting.
be
Pretty cool.
terrific.
Yeah.
That's
That'd be
great
amazing.
for our
Yeah.
industry.
Mm-hmm.
And then they'll come up with a new strategy going into then COP31 the following year, which will be in either Australia or Turkey, right?
Yeah. Yeah. TBD.
Seems like an interesting dichotomy of choices there.
Right?
Right.
The other thing that I feel like I didn't know about before I went was how many corporates go to COP.
Yeah.
Like, so I was in a meeting actually with a bunch of staffers for Republican members of Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And it was myself and Lisa Jacobson sort of representing the clean energy industry, and then all of the big investor-owned utilities in the country, and a couple of the municipally owned utilities. And then I was at another meeting with like LinkedIn and Google and Amazon and Facebook, like all of those kinds of big corporates are all at COP. And then a lot of the consumer-facing brands are all at COP. And like one of the staffers asked the utilities, like, bluntly, why are you here?
Right.
And the CEO talked about, like, we are talking about the energy transition, right? This is our business, and we need to understand where the policy is going, where the technology is going, where the market is going. What can we learn from our colleagues in other countries? What can we learn from technology providers? Like, how does this all come together? I was on a Financial Times panel with, is it Nokia or Nokia? Whatever. Y'all know what I'm talking about.
One of those.
NOKIA, right? It provides like 1/3 of the world's wireless system?
Access?
Whatever the right
Infrastructure?
Yeah, infrastructure. We'll go with infrastructure. So he and I were chatting in front of this group about like the role of the wireless network in the energy transition, right? Like one of the largest corporates in the entire world. And so I guess I had more of a like maybe a perception that COP would be dominated by, this environmental group and that environmental group and that environmental group. And there certainly are well represented. I was not fully appreciative of the level of commitment of corporates to this process. And that, I think, is one of the things as I think about engagement in 2025 in Brazil is like, those are the conversations that I want SEIA and our members to be a part of, right? Like
exactly
connecting with those other businesses around how do we link together to push this energy transition.
Yeah. Well, and I think that speaks to maybe my closing question here, which is like, if we think about our audience here, a lot of clean energy businesses in the US, let's sort of spell out the use case for attending this event, right? Because I think you just kind of alluded to, like, the utility industry sees a lot of value in this event. The corporate, the big, Fortune 50, Fortune 500 companies see a lot of value in participating. Just alone, that's basically the entire customer base for the clean energy industry.
Right.
Plus all of the the government officials and the environmental organizations. Like it seems pretty clear to me what the value of attending an event like this for a U.S. solar company might be. But let's be more explicit. What do we think the value is?
Yeah, I mean, you said a lot of it, right? Which is that on the utility scale side of the house, pretty much all of your customers are there, right? Utilities, corporates, different levels of government. And they are there in an intensely intimate way, right? Like, first of all, there are, 50, 60,000 people, but you're not interacting with all 50 or 60,000. Like it's a pretty discrete segment of the COP attendees that you're interacting with. And so you have sort of access that you
Right.
might not have in other ways. And there's lots of side events that you sort of in the mix. But then if you think about sort of distributed generation and how much of the world is seeking distributed generation solutions, talking about energy poverty, talking about different parts of the world where there's not necessarily, we think our transmission infrastructure is bad, where there might not be any at all,
Yeah.
right? And then there's a whole different solution set. All of those countries are there, and they are hungry for solutions as well. And so, it's a business opportunity. There is a way to both expose oneself and expose your business to customers and markets that it would take months and months of travel around the United States and the world to get all of those people together.
Right. There's no way you show up at COP and don't come away with something really valuable. My strategy for for taking us to Baku this year was press, media, inserting our message into a space where we wouldn't otherwise be, right? The meat and potatoes of the Global Renewables Hub, the Foreign Policy Roundtable, the Financial Times Roundtable, the Republican delegation receptions and meetings and roundtables, the fireside chat with the secretary, some of the closed door roundtables, the one-on-ones with the Brazilians, the one-on-ones with the Germans, the one-on-ones with the Indian delegations, the Australians, right? There's so many ways to make a trip like this productive. We tried to dip our toe in every little vertical. And I think we made the most of a really short of a week in Baku. But our members can do the same thing. And we could think about a way to develop a strategy where we're bringing some along with us for the ride, or they could do it on their own. We were surprised to find a couple of members there, and we didn't know they were going to be there.
Yeah.
But there's so many ways to make to have a conversation. Like Abby said, if all you do is focus on corporate sustainability and how you can frame that up as a big, huge publicly traded company, which we have a few members, that would be a huge takeaway for them. How should we be thinking about these things for our stockholders? And it's just the sky's the limit.
Yeah. Yeah, from the business and the policy lens, I think a lot of people assume that it's sort of this government convening that's mostly about big picture policy ideas, and they miss a bit of the business opportunity aspect too.
And in all fairness, historically, COP has been that.
Yeah.
But over the last 3 years or so, it's really started to change, where the private sector has shown up. We're the ones with the practical solutions. Get the boots on the ground, making these things happen. So there's a role to play for the private sector to be there. And I think Abby's showing up this year was hugely significant, because in the absence of some of the educating you were able to do in the first few days of COP, when all the world leaders were showing up, was news and information and data that the press corps wouldn't have been exposed to otherwise. So that was great.
It was a great trip.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I'm glad that you guys were there, and I'm glad that the U.S. is continuing to show up there, and that we've got sort of new avenues to demonstrate leadership and keep this party going. So until 2025, until COP30, we'll have this conversation again, I hope.
Excellent.
Thanks, Colin.